When last we left our heroes, hey everybody, Matt Colville here. This is the third campaign diary where we recap what happened in D&D last Wednesday and also pull back the curtain a little bit and give you some behind-the-scenes info on my thinking as the Dungeon Master and the things that I thought were going to happen and then the things that did happen and what I think about those things. So the Chain of Acheron are on the Rosso Cielo and find themselves in the Astral Sea, which I call the Sea of Stars. This was another little bit of dramatic irony, of which there's often a lot in a hot start like this, where the players are playing characters who all know each other and have had adventures before, but the players haven't had those adventures. So it's not unusual in a scenario like this for me to have to explain to the players things their characters know. Like, for instance, the Chain of Acheron. If you read the history of the chain, like the last 5 contracts they've taken, which you can find on our website, I'll make sure there's a link in the doobly-doo. One of those contracts was working for many years for the Lady of Brass, also known as the Queen of Fire, and she was the ruler of the City of Brass, also known as Alloy, on the plane of Quintessence, and that in her service they were sort of adventurers. She is a notorious kind of Robin Hood character who would go through the timescape, which is my term for the multi. I'm doing it right now, the huge info dump right now. The timescape is my term for the multiverse. And using the world between worlds or the sea between worlds or the Sea of Stars is an easy way, those are all different names for the same thing, an easy way to get from one world to another. So this notion of this shallow, flat, featureless, weatherless sea shrouded in pale white fog that is constantly illuminated from above, leaving no shadows. There's light filling every crevice, and when you look overboard, you see constellations. This is something they have seen before, experienced before. They know how to get around here, but the players don't know. The idea is that this plane, this universe they find themselves in, exists between all universes. They see the crew of the Rosso Cielo are standing there silently. They have furled all the sails. They've taken down all the rigging, and some of them are still moving around doing their jobs, but some of them are just standing there holding onto a mast or grabbing a railing, and they're thinking. And I explained that this is the process via which ships or people or things get around in the Sea of Stars. It's via the power of thought. Of course, the players immediately ask, can we get the Chain of Acheron? There's between 40 and 60 soldiers that work for us. Can we get them all concentrating on the direction and make the ship go faster? And I said, absolutely, yes. Diego, the Rosso Cielo's navigator, is up in the crow's nest, and from the crow's nest he can look down and he can see the constellations, and because he recognizes these constellations, they are the inverse of the constellations in the real world, he can navigate the ship, and he navigates by calling out, 4, meaning just keep going forward, 4 as opposed to aft, and just keep going straight, just keep concentrating on going straight, and then he'll course correct by saying port or starboard, and he's brought with him a mirror, basically, that he holds up and looks up into so he can orient, because every once in a while he gets disoriented, and by looking at the stars below him, reflected in a mirror, it reverses the image back to the constellations he's used to. We spend a little while, I don't know how long it was in real world time, but we spend a little while with the Chain of Acheron on the Rosso Cielo, just dealing with the fact that they're on the Sea of Stars, and what is it like here, and what kinds of things do they see in the mist? For instance, at one point, I sort of intended everybody to be able to see this, but I think ultimately it was just Copper and Big Cat who were on deck, and they notice this giant, literally a giant, walking through the ocean. I started by describing that you could hear these sounds like waves crashing, this kind of It turns out these are the massive footsteps of a huge giant, like 100 feet tall. They never get any features. All they can see is the silhouette of this thing. And there are often mountains and islands that they can see through the mist. So this one is like an island that moves. When they first see it, it looks like it's just a tall, thin lump, but then it starts moving and it's dragging something behind it. Copper asks if this, hey, is this normal? And Diego, the navigator, calls out that the fissure is off the port side. The fissure is the name. They don't know anything about this giant. They just call him the fissure because he drags behind him this huge net, like he's trawling the astral sea for something they have no idea what. Well-read followers of my content may detect some similarities between my version of the Astral Sea and that same phenomenon that you find in the Eternal Champions book by Michael Moorcock. I may have mentioned this before. Take the stuff you like and stick it in your game. And so that's what I did. And the Fisher is literally, he's not called that, but he's literally a phenomenon, a character, question mark, from, I think, the Quorum books by Michael Moorcock. So that was a neat little moment, and I was playing some music that I composed on my synth that I made, it makes it sound very grand, that I made on my modular synth on purpose that I wanted to sound like the astral sea using this really cool choral reverb. So it sounds like voices singing. And I tell them, this is literally what you hear. This is diegetic music. This is what it sounds like in the astral sea. And I also describe all other kinds of effects, like they can hear rocks falling from a great height and bouncing off each other every once in a while. And they hear tones out in the distance, and they hear footsteps sometimes, like it's right next to them, right behind them, but there's nobody there. These are the ghosts of other things from other worlds. And they talk about, the crew talk about how there's all kinds of stuff in the astral sea, including dead gods. So spooky music deployed, and I think pretty successful. Folks watching seemed to like the spooky music from the Time Rider, and it definitely seemed to get the heroes, the players, in the mood. We then had what I think of as our first real legitimate role-playing encounter, where Sweet, Phil's character, the commander of the Chain of Acheron, now used to be Lieutenant Sweet, now Commander Sweet is a pugilist. Sweet encounters this sailor from the Rosso Cielo named Jasper. Jasper is a big guy, he's really cut, he's got this shock of short, white, sticky-uppy hair. Sticky uppy. Pointy, short, pointy hair. And this character, Jasper, offers Phil a smoke. And if I had been more together, I would have brought a couple of my pipes, because Phil's character said that he likes to smoke a pipe. And I asked him about that earlier, and so I should have brought a couple of pipes. That would have been a neat little prop. Jasper offers Phil a pipe, and he lights it up, and they start smoking. And I think Jasper might have asked Phil a question or something, or Sweet asked Sweet a question. And then Jasper kind of gives Sweet a look and says, "You don't recognize me, do you?" And Phil's like, do I recognize this guy? And I asked him to make an insight check, and he does. He remembers this guy from his boxing days. This is part of Phil's backstory. Phil wrote a 5-page backstory, maybe the most elaborate backstory in the group, which is pretty awesome. And we'll do a whole running the game video on how to use backstories, but this is kind of part of that. Is I didn't even bother, by the way, this is a preview. You're getting a preview of that running the game video. A lot of the players, they wrote backstories. I sort of skimmed them just to get the general gist of it. And then I was like, well, I got stuff to do. Let's get this campaign on the road. But now when I need moments, when I want moments, I go to their backstories and I start mining them. So I don't really feel obligated to read the entire thing before we even start, especially when it's 5 pages. But I do feel that it is my responsibility to read it all eventually. And we're only 3 episodes in, and it's already paying off. So this character, Jasper, is somebody Sweet used to box with back in Black Bottom when he was like a late teenager, because that's Sweet's backstory, is he used to be a fighter. He used to run with a gang. I don't think that came up. We didn't talk about any of that stuff, but he definitely fought, and there's like a whole circuit. It's like a real legitimate thing. And Sweet was pretty good, and Jasper remembers Sweet being pretty good, and Jasper getting the hell knocked out of him and losing to Sweet. And he also remembers this one fight that Sweet got in with a guy named Badger, and how he basically, as I remember it, Jasper said, "Didn't you kill that guy? Wasn't it one shot? I remember I won a bunch of money betting on you." Phil seemed to have a good time role-playing Sweet, and I certainly had a good time role-playing Jasper and having this interaction. And I had a whole bunch of questions written up. I only asked about half of them, because about halfway through this encounter, Phil literally stopped and said, "I screwed up. I, Phil, have screwed up, because now that I think about it, Sweet would never have said, 'Yeah, I remember you.' Sweet would have said, 'You got the wrong guy, pal.'" And I believe him. That seems reasonable for Sweet, but I also think it's reasonable for Sweet, especially on the astral sea, now in command of the Chain of Acheron, which is not something he expected to be kind of off guard, and to just answer this guy honestly. Like, they've already had dinner with the senior officers of the Rosso Cielo, and they get along with the guys on this ship, so why wouldn't he do that? But Phil was upset. He was upset that there was a moment that he thought, looking back, would have been very dramatic, and he was probably right, to kind of blow the guy off. And that would have sort of put all of my plans into a cocked hat. It would have been like, well, I wrote up all these questions, but now I don't know how I'm going to get to use them. But that wouldn't really have bothered me, as long as Phil was doing what Phil thinks Sweet would do. But having had this revelation where he's like, I would never have said that, I think Phil did something really interesting. He rolled with it. He and Jasper talked. He kind of said, listen, that's my old life. I don't talk about that anymore. And Jasper's like, okay, I get it. Hey, do you want to come down to like the junior officers mess and meet some of the guys and get a drink, and it'll be on me? And Phil's like, sure. So they go down to some below decks. I don't have deck plans for the Rosso Cielo. I do have a vague idea of how a galleon works in my head. So they go down to some unmentioned previously deck where they drink with the junior officers. And I I explain how these guys are a little like, what's this guy? He's a senior officer. The senior officer shouldn't be drinking with us. But Phil did a good job role-playing, buying these guys drinks and stuff. And Jasper kind of prodded and poked, but then stayed back when Phil was reticent to get into Sweet's backstory. And I thought that was fine. But then Phil did something I thought was really interesting after this entire encounter was over. And it could have gone on a lot more. Like I said, I had a lot of questions that Jasper could have asked. But after this was over, Phil went and called for one of his retainers. I think Phil's character only has a +1 bonus in charisma, which means he only has one retainer. The retainers are something from Strongholds and Followers that it seems like people like. That makes me happy. I get tweets and messages on Reddit with people talking about using the retainer rules. I love that. But this is something I made up. The idea that the senior officers of the chain would each have a number of retainers equal to their charisma modifier. Phil's character Sweet has a +1, so he has one retainer, and that's Angel. Angel is a male halfling executioner, which is a type of, it's a specialty of rogue. Like a rogue assassin PC would be an executioner retainer. They're equivalent, but it's sort of like a retainer is, if I grow up, I could be a rogue someday. I don't ever get all of the abilities of a rogue. I'm not a player character. I have a reduced instruction set, you might say. I had not anticipated having to play Angel, so I didn't have any idea. This has come up a couple times now. I had no idea who Two Shoes was until I started having to extemporaneously roleplay her, and that was a lot of fun. And I had no idea who Angel was. I mean, I had read Phil's description of this retainer, but I had no idea what their personality was or what their attitude was, and then I had to kind of spontaneously make it up. Well, I had played a halfling thief in a game that Phil had been in earlier. I think you can actually watch this on YouTube. I had played this character named Willoughby Twobuckle, and Willoughby Twobuckle is like a kind of New York gangster assassin type of character. And so I played Angel as being a lot more flat, a lot more monotone, a lot less cocky, a lot less garrulous. He talked a lot less. And I stole a little bit of characterization from the Black Company. I had him using a knife to clean his fingernails, a la Raven from the Black Company. I think we should start my Appendix N series, and we'll do it book by book, and it should certainly start with The Black Company by Glenn Cook. So look forward to that. Phil has Angel go and basically infiltrate the junior officers of the Rosso Cielo and watch Jasper and listen and find out, is that guy talking about me? Is that guy telling everybody what he knows about me, what my background is? Because if so, we have a problem. And Angel's like, okay, yeah, I'll listen to him. And if he says anything, you want me to kill him? And Phil's like, no, don't, I mean, maybe, but no, come tell me first. And Angel's like, no problem, boss. I can make it look like an accident. And then I literally accidentally stabbed myself. I was using a mechanical pencil as a prop to substitute in for a dagger. And I literally stabbed myself under the cuticle with my pencil. And that was comedic and unfortunate, but a great little beat. This is something I did on purpose because I wanted to draw the characters out. I know that Phil is a good role player when he's behind the DM screen. When he's the dungeon master, he is aces. But when he's on the other side of the screen, he tends to get really self-conscious, and I want to kind of draw him out, and I think that worked. It's going to be weeks, if not months, before all of these players are equally comfortable just extemporaneously playing their characters, but this is the process. It's work, and it's work on my end as the dungeon master to identify each character one at a time and say, okay, I'm going to have an encounter just me and that character. One of the things I like that Jerry does, this is something he kind of designed, was when it's just me and Phil talking, you get this two-shot, basically. You don't see the other players in the live stream. It's just me on one side and Phil on the other. Jerry doesn't have any kind of like shot list. He just has to watch live and pick different cameras, and he did a great job, and it was a lot of fun to watch back. And people seem to like that. I was just really impressed with Phil as a role player because he felt like he screwed up. He didn't ask for a retcon, and he didn't just ignore his screw up. He managed to contextualize it. Him calling for Angel and kind of sicking Angel on Jasper and saying, watch that guy, find out if he talks about me, find out if he says anything about me. And if he does, he may have to have an accident happen to him, was Phil's way of contextualizing his own screw up and making it Sweet's screw up. How would Sweet deal with the fact that he gave away too much? And there'd be a point in this conversation when Sweet would think, uh-oh, I've said too much. Now what do I do? Well, I do have this other resource. I do have Angel. And if it comes down to it, Angel can take care of this guy. I just thought that was an amazing decision on the part of Phil as a role player, and I hope we get to see more stuff like that. There's a point during the conversation, I think it was with Jasper and Sweet, where a dwarven member of the Chain of Acheron, one of these rank and file soldiers, walks by Copper and Big Cat kind of growls at him, and the dwarf is like, does your cat bite? And in that moment, Phil like he at the end of that, after the dwarf left, Phil was like a little bit suspicious about that dwarf, and he asked some questions, but he didn't. Nobody followed up. But that might become important later on. Obviously, there's very little that the Dungeon Master tells the players that isn't in some way important to something. So we had a little bit of what's it like on the Astral Sea. We had a little bit of a role-playing encounter with Sweet and this guy named Jasper. And then we get to the meat of the session, and probably the main course, you might say, of this session and at least the next session, and maybe even the session after that, depending on how far the players get. The captain shouts out from the quarterdeck. They can't see her because they're on the main deck and she's one deck up and then a little bit back. But they hear her call out, "Somnium Tenebris aft." And as soon as she says this, I think somebody was having a conversation with Cadesto. I think it might have been Judge. As soon as she says this, everyone on the Rosso Cielo, all the sailors, their jaws go slack, and Cadesto looks terrified. Cadesto says, "This is impossible." The players run up to the quarterdeck to get a look at whatever this thing is behind them, and they see the Dark Dream. This is the art that I showed the players of the Dark Dream. This is an original piece of art that we had a friend of ours draw in anticipation of tonight's setting. And the idea, as soon as you look at it, you can kind of tell that this is a Mind Flayer ship. And it's supposed to kind of be like, because it's native to the Sea of Stars, it's kind of a combination between a actual ocean-going vessel and a spaceship. The art was pretty effective. I thought it was spectacular. I love that art. I would love to make a model of the Somnium Tenebris, the Dark Dream. And the captain at this point starts basically freaking out. She explains that this ship is a raiding ship. It has tentacles. The tentacles will reach out. It will grab the Rosso Cielo. There'll be a boarding action. And even if they win the boarding action, the tentacles will crush the Rosso Cielo. And as soon as the ship is in range, King casts Call Lightning, which effectively does nothing. There's no way for Lars to know this, but obviously, having a 5th level cleric on a ship like this this is a problem that even higher level ships have had to deal with. Lightning stabs into the tentacles, and you can see that it's doing something, but it's really super minor. And then the ship fires back in response. There's this huge blast of green plasma that smashes into the back of the Rosso Cielo, which was a little bit of foreshadowing. As the Dark Dream bears down on the Rosso Cielo, going much faster than the crew of the Rosso Cielo can think. Remember, everything here moves at the speed of thought. They unfurl sails, and the sails have very crudely painted on them a symbol. And Phil says, "It's the symbol of Ajax, isn't it?" And I'm like, yep. And I describe it as being a ram. There's actually a term for this. It's like stantant gardent, which means that it's in profile, its hind legs are on the ground, its front legs are reared up a little bit, and its head is turned toward the viewer, but its front 2 legs are on a globe that is supposed to represent the Earth. That's the symbol, I decided, of Ajax. I wanted that kind of Roman Greek notion, and I looked at actually a bunch of different Roman legionnaire flags, and one of them literally had a ram on it. And I'm like, I didn't want to go with the eagle motif because I felt like the eagle motif was a little bit cheap. And if you've watched any of the world building streams, you know that the way I tend to do stuff like this is I say, what are all the most obvious things? And I throw those out. And I go, what is the next thing that is the least most obvious thing? The captain sort of loses her shit at this point, and she grabs Sweet by the shirt and says, "This is impossible. How did they find us? How did they know where we are?" And then she looks at him and she shouts right in his face, "Who are you people?" Phil reacts by slowly pulling the captain's, because obviously the captain doesn't have a belt of hill giant strength the way Sweet does, so there's nothing really she can do about it. It was just her in a moment of panic. This is her ship that's going to get torn apart, and it's largely because she accepted the Chain of Acheron onto her boat, and the fact that Ajax has been able to hunt them across the timescape is not something the players have really wondered about. They haven't really had much time to wonder about it, but it's not something they've talked about, and it's going to become an important plot point later on. The players pretty quickly unravel what the captain is saying, and they understand that there's going to be a boarding action, but then after that, the tentacles are going to tear the ship apart. And some of the players still were thinking, oh, these tentacles should be, they were thinking of them as being like octopus tentacles instead of being like massive, huge tentacles that can rip a ship apart. And there were a couple of moments where they're like, oh, we start hacking at the tentacles. And I was like, well, I mean, you can do that, but the ship will be destroyed by the time you do anything useful there. We just happen to have, 50 feet or whatever of ether Ethernet cable here in a purple sheath, and so I just had Jerry cut off 4 pieces that are about this long of Ethernet cable, and I laid them out on the battle map of the Rosso Cielo to show where the tentacles were grabbing the ship, and that was a neat little, visual aid. So then we move into the boarding action. The tentacles have wrapped around the ship, granting the Dark Dream's crew the pathways they need to get onto the ship, and the heroes can hear this sound like soldiers marching, like cavalry charging, but they can't see anything. And that's because the crew of the Dark Dream, at least the raiders that they're dealing with right now, are all Dwagar, and Dwagar can go invisible basically at will. The Dwagar don't exactly have surprise by the actual textbook definition of the term. The players know that they are there, right? They can hear that there's something happening. They are prepared for battle. They just don't know exactly where. And so I probably could have had the Dwagar, I probably could have given the Dwagar advantage on their first attacks. I probably should have done that. But I just placed the Dwagar out on, and a couple of them were steed riders. They're Dwagar with flame lances on giant spiders. And this was not only an encounter, it was also a battle. We made units. We made 1 unit of Dwagar infantry, and then 1 small unit, a D4 unit of pirate infantry, and 1 unit representing the actual Chain of Acheron. All of the other rank and file soldiers that our heroes are the commanders of. So that was fun, getting a chance to use the battle rules. It was pretty uneventful because somewhat atypically, although it's always possible, like in any battle, over the course of the encounter, as the heroes are fighting the Dwagar, they're commanding their units to take actions against the enemy. And even though they had 2 units, and so they got to attack twice every round, and the Dwagar only had 1, no one was really able to damage anyone else. That's pretty unusual with the battle rules, but it is possible, right? It's always possible when you're playing that you could just, the equivalent is, imagine it was a huge battle with lots of actual PCs and NPCs, and they hit half the time, but then imagine if they were always rolling like 1s and 2s for damage. That is possible, and the result would be the rounds and rounds of combat would go by and no one was really dying, and that's what happened. But there was a victory condition, which was if the heroes beat the Dwagar in their combat, then the unit of Dwagar are going to retreat back to the ship, and that's exactly what happened. The Dwagar battle was pretty uneventful. Judge dropped a silence on a whole bunch of the Dwagar warriors, but they weren't spellcasters, so it didn't do anything. But I don't think Anna, I know that Lars didn't say anything, but Lars was thinking, that was a waste of your action and that spell, because none of these guys, they don't have any spellcasters. He couldn't see any spellcasters in the battle, and they didn't really have any. They had a couple of regular infantry, they had a soul blade, they had a couple of the steed riders, and that was about it. It wasn't supposed to be a super challenging encounter, and looking back at it, it went a little easy on the heroes. I think the Dwagar don't have that many hit points. I think the average Dwagar soldier only has about 26 hit points. All of the encounters in this session were all completely legal. These were all appropriate for a 5th level party. That's the reason I used Dwagar instead of Githyanki. I wanted to have the whole ship be all Githyanki, but as it turns out, when you look in a list, if you go look to like Kobold Fight Club or whatever and say, show me all Githyanki, there's like a 3rd level Githyanki, and then there's an 8th level Githyanki, and then all the rest of them are 13th or 10th or 14th level. And so I was like, oh, I can't really, unless I want to take all the Githyanki and level them way down to make them appropriate for a 5th level party, I got to use something else. And I sort of decided, I just made a decision. I said, okay, I'm not going to do that, because if the idea is you should only be fighting Githyanki when you're like about 10th level, then let's stick to that, so that we have something to do when the players get to 10th level. We have bad guys left that they haven't really had to fight en masse, so to speak. And so I was just like, well, what would be appropriate? And I instantly hit on Dwagar, because Illithids often use both Dwagar and Gith as slaves. So it's very easy. There's tons of Dwagar in 5th edition of various levels. It was very easy for me to make a combat encounter that was nothing but Dwagar. The problem, of course, is that I think I erred a little too on the side of caution. They only had, like I said, about 26 hit points each. The problem was, I think, just that the Dwagar needed a few more cool special abilities. I think the battle would have been a lot cooler and a lot more fun if normal everyday Dwagar could just do something besides, they start off with invisibility and they begin the battle by enlarging, and after that, there wasn't really much for them to do. So generally speaking, in a battle like this, I think we need more, of course I would say this because I really liked 4th edition, we need more kind of 4th edition abilities for normal everyday Dwagar to have some kind of proc, some kind of thing that is a % rate of casting when they're fighting. fighting, and if the right situation comes up, they get to do this cool thing. I don't know what that would be, but if they keep fighting Dwagar on this ship, or if they fight Dwagar again, that's probably what I'm going to do. The battle was pretty uneventful. I think it was only 3 rounds that the units were fighting each other, and neither the heroes nor the enemy units were able to harm anybody. But then the heroes finally dispatch the Dwagar, the armies retreat, and now the players are left with these tentacles about to rip the Ra Sociolo apart. I did that on purpose because I wanted to light a fire under the heroes' asses to motivate them to board the Dark Dream, because I had this whole idea that it's going to be like a dungeon crawl, basically, in space, in the astral sea. I had a whole map for this Illithid dreadnought that I got online, but that map shows there's, 6 different levels, and there's a total of something like, I don't know, there's probably like 60 or 70 rooms in this giant ship, and I definitely did not want to have the players have to clear this dreadnought by going room by room for 70 or 40 or 50 rooms or whatever. I love dungeon crawls. Like I've said before, I come from a time when you measured progress in terms of how many rooms you would cleared out. I also come from a time when we would play Dungeons and Dragons until we physically couldn't anymore. It was 3 o'clock in the morning, we were exhausted and we had to stop. But that's not this campaign. I don't know if I'll ever play in a campaign like that again. So I made the decision. Having the map helped because it fueled my design. It made it easy for me to just pick and choose a handful of encounters. How many? There could be as few as 3, maybe 5 or 6 encounters to take the Dark Dream. And by the way, so far, that is working. We have not had to track the motion of the heroes through the ship using graph paper or anything like that. I was prepared to do that, but it turned out we didn't need to. There was one point where Lars is like, I'm really confused. Can we do this on graph paper? And I'm like, it's literally just a corridor that ends in a door, and then there's another door over here. And I'm like, I refuse to draw this out. This is something that it's the simplest possible choice you can make in a dungeon. There's a corridor and there are 2 doors at the end at a 90-degree angle. Which one are you guys going to choose? So apart from that, running this ship on an encounter by encounter basis and just thinking in terms of a dramatic structure. How do I dramatically structure the taking of the ship as though it were a Star Trek episode? And actually, Star Trek is a pretty good analogy for the Chain of Acheron, because the heroes in my game are essentially playing the bridge crew of the starship Acheron. And all of these other characters, the junior officers and all the rank and file soldiers, are sort of mostly out of sight, out of mind. And the fact that they exist gives some things stakes. It gives the heroes interesting options, like that battle on the deck of the Ra Sociolo. They had their own unit for their own soldiers, but mostly it's going to be the senior officers beaming down to the planet and taking care of stuff. They're still an adventuring party. After arguing for not very long, probably only like a minute or 2 about whether or not they should board the Dark Dream, Phil just says, wait, I'm the commander. Board that ship. Which I loved. I thought was very dramatic. We got some really cool fan art of it. I described the tentacles as leading to 2 different decks, a lower deck and a kind of a middle deck, and the heroes just said, can we have our junior officers command our unit of soldiers to take the lower deck while we run up the tentacles that lead to the upper deck? And I was like, absolutely. I thought that was a really cool idea. I hadn't thought of that, but it meant that I was able to kind of move some encounters around, and I was able to, they encountered that it didn't matter which of the two levels they went to. They were going to experience the same things anyway, but they didn't know that. I love the idea that there's this one huge deck at the bottom. It's called the cattle deck. That's where they keep their slaves, and that this is where this major battle between the Dwagar and the Chain of Acheron soldiers are going to be, but it's going to be off screen. And obviously, in a situation like that, the hero unit is going to win. I'm not going to take their unit of soldiers away from them off screen. That would be ridiculous. Sweet orders them onto the Somnium Tenebris, the Dark Dream, the Illithid interdimensional pirate ship, and the heroes charge up the tentacles. The heroes take the top 2 tentacles while their soldiers take the bottom 2. And I afterwards, I thought, maybe I should have made getting on the Dark Dream its own encounter. Like they were just able to run up the tentacles and be on the ship. But then looking back, I was like, no, that was the boarding action. That was them fighting the Dwagar. That was the lock that they had to get a key to in order to get onto the ship. So I think that was fine in retrospect. Now it's just the 5 senior officers, the party, basically, right? The adventuring party, the bridge crew. It's now just the 5 members, the senior officers of the Chain of Acheron on the Dark Dream. They're by themselves, and they're on a long corridor that stretches, I think I said east-west. And I described the corridor as having thick purple walls with these bright pink veins running along them that are almost fluorescent, and it's oval shaped. The corridor that they're in, and there's this thin, milky white liquid that's just constantly running down the corridor and kind of sloshing up against their boots. I stole that image, I think, from Buckaroo Banzai. Phil takes a moment to grab an axe and slice into the walls of the Somnium Tenebris, and the walls split open. I was imagining like whale fat, right? Where there's not really any blood, but it's definitely tissue of some sort, so it's a living thing. And I described it early on as looking like a living creature that they had built a giant ship on top of. The players are aware they're trying to get to the bridge, basically, and that it's presumably up, so they go up the corridor and they find a series of rooms. There are no doors, there's just these round, oval, orifice-looking archways, and each room has a chamber in it. I think it's like, I described it as being as big as the room that we were playing D&D in, and at the far side of the chamber, there was this kind of like ballista thing mounted, and there's an open window that the ballista can shoot through. This shows a little bit about how I GM, the difference between my prep and my improv, because I knew there was a psionic cannon. There was a whole bunch of them. Remember that the Dark Dream returned fire somehow. So there was going to be a bunch of psionic cannons on this deck, and I knew how they worked. I knew that they need a mind, a slave's mind, to power them. But apart from that, I had no description of them whatsoever. So if you watch the video, you can see me basically improv that these things are made out of brass. They have two handles. There's a bladder under one handle you can press down, and now there's a hole in the brass for the bladder to fit into, and how there are these tubes that stick out of the middle, and there's a crystal, and the fact that it looks, I was imagining it looking like a very kind of like 20,000 Leagues Beneath the Sea, like Captain Nemo style Victorian brass fixtures and fittings all throughout the thing. I made all that up. I just knew, oh, there's going to be a cannon here. And I didn't make any more details in my notes. And the reason I didn't put any more details in my notes was because Prep Matt knew that DM Matt could just improv it and make it up and come up with something cool. I have learned, and I think this is something we all go through as we DM, I have learned which things I'm good at and which things I'm bad at. So when I'm doing prep, I make sure that, like, for instance, I'm really bad at making up names on the spot. So my notes always have a bunch of names in case I need them. But things like details of how mechanisms work and stuff like that, I'm pretty good at just making that up. The players debate whether or not they should, like, Nails, I think at one point volunteers to stick his head into this thing to... I think Nails at one point volunteered to let the tentacles get a hold of him. These tentacles are just tubes. There's these clear plastic tubes that are only about this long, but there's 4 or 5 of them sticking out from the center console of this psionic cannon. And they, as soon as a person comes near, they start reaching for the person. They can detect life. Nails volunteers to let the tubes go into him. He's like, wow, what could happen? But Judge is immediately like, no, that is not a good idea. You stay away from these things. The Nail still has his silver eyes, but really not much has happened. Tom brought some cool silver sunglasses to wear, and I think I'm going to ask him to wear them more. I think he took them off because he thought they were kind of ostentatious, but I think they are a great role-playing aid, and nothing really happened with Nails other than his damage floor started to tick up. I just passed him notes saying, like, your minimum damage per die is now 2 or now 3, and his stats, his int and whiz are going up. But apart from those things, which aren't really obvious, I don't know that the players noticed that, nothing really happened with Nails, except there was one point where Nails asked, hey, can I sense whether or not there's any battle happening below decks? Like, are our guys down there fighting? I thought about it, and I was like, yeah, you can detect what's going on. You're aware that there is a battle going down below, and that your guys seem to be winning, and the players didn't ask why he was asking that or what he knew, and these are obviously, I'm not giving anything away. This happened, and this is the no spoilers for future events. So if you didn't watch the section from the previous campaign diary talking about the spoilers, I'm not giving anything away here, but Nails thinks hard and is able to detect, become aware of the battle happening below decks. He didn't really do anything with that information, though. I don't even actually know why he asked that. So Judge is like, no, you're not going to let those tubes get into you. And Phil, as sweet, he's got a Belt of Hill Giant strength. And by the way, all of the treasure that the heroes have, that the Chain of Acheron have, are all perfectly legitimate legal treasure for a 5th level party to have based on the random treasure rules. And I think Xanathar's Guide to Everything is what I used. Phil's got a Belt of Hill Giant strength. So he has Sweet make a roll to see if he can rip this thing. I should have thought of this because my character did this back in 1980. 8, I think, probably, when we were being fired upon. These ballistas were shooting at us in this pirate ship, and we boarded the ship, and I think it must have been some kind of like extraordinary strength, and I grabbed one of these ballistas and I was walking around with it, this thing that's not supposed to be man portable, but Phil's got a strength of like, I don't know, 20 or 21 or whatever hill giant strength gets you. And so I was 100% down with the idea that Phil could be walking around with a psionic cannon. He would just need a living brain to power it. If they were willing to do that, by all means. I even gave him advantage on the roll because I said, listen, this thing's not trying to put up a fight, but he only rolled a 14. And I was like, it would probably take a 15 to get a regular ballista, to rip a regular mounted weapon out of its mount. And this thing is much nicer and more sturdily made than like a wooden weapon. So they didn't get the psionic cannon in that room, and they just keep going down the corridor, and they find more rooms that are identical to that first one with more psionic cannons in them. And then they find one that has a figure attached to it. And Judge walks in, this thing doesn't react, and Judge hews with his, I think he's got like a flamberge, basically like a twisted sword. He hews at this body without asking what it is, without doing any kind of examination. Judge just sees a figure in there, assumes it's an enemy, and attacks. I have them chop the head of the enemy in two because this thing's already comatose, right? And so now there is a newly dead mind flayer spilling its Pepto-Bismol like blood on the floor, and half of its boneless, these things don't have, they have bladders and tubes to give them shape and form. Mind flayers don't have bones. Half of its head is still like attached to this psionic cannon, and it's deflating, and the hero's like, ew. But now they're starting to piece together. It took them a while. It took them basically, I think you may not have seen this because they had a long discussion after the cameras went off, which I wish we could have caught, but the players are not yet comfortable, for whatever reason, having those conversations on camera. So they talked about it afterwards, and they figured out that there's been some kind of rebellion on this ship. The mind flayers who normally are in charge are now the being used by whoever is in charge, at least either the Dwagar, or they figured probably some Githyanki, and they are correct. They are going to meet some Githyanki. The players do a little bit of investigation, and they're starting to piece together that these cannons need a brain to fire, and I'm not even sure that they pieced together that this was the cannon that shot at them, and it was able to do it because it had the living but comatose mind flayer brain in it. While they're thinking about all of this, I have the players make a perception check, and there's only really Judge and Copper in the room now. Everyone else has left the room and figured, well, we've investigated all we can investigate. There's nothing else to see in here, and they're heading out. But Copper and Judge are still arguing about what to do about this cannon, and I have Judge notice that there's a rat, an everyday, perfectly normally sized, not a rodent of unusual size, rat, watching Judge from the wall. And Judge reaches out, makes a acrobatics check or a dex check, and grabs this rat, and then notices that this rat has it has like a case on its head that exposes, it's like a clear plastic case exposing its brain, so you can see its brain. And I know that what Anna wanted to do was Anna wanted to squish this thing, like, and show that Judge is kind of doesn't have much regard for living things. But before Anna could think of that, she was like, I can see its brain? And at that point, I have the characters make saving throws, specifically only Copper and Judge, because they're the only ones left in the room. And now it's a battle, Copper and Judge versus 2 swarms of Cranium rats, which was the second combat so far. I'm trying to get to like 6 encounters in this dungeon. We'll see what happens. The first encounter was the boarding action on the deck of the Rossos Yellow. This is the second encounter. And these Cranium rats, they were a lot of fun. I thought it was totally appropriate for a kind of now somewhat falling apart Illithid ship, right? The Illithids aren't in charge anymore, and so things are sort of going to pot. They're kind of starting to feel like a ruined ship, and the Cranium rats, which normally are probably, you know, the Illithid have slaves to take care of them, now they're getting a little bit frisky, and these 2 swarms of Cranium rats attack Judge and Copper. They start off with confusion, and I was kind of blown away. I read the spells, and I even have cards, and I've highlighted, using a highlighter, their relevant stats, including the spells I thought they would use, and I was like, oh, they have Confusion and Dominate Monster. That's going to be pretty fun and useful. And then I looked up Dominate Monster, because I forget which Dominates and Charms are of which level, and Dominate Monster is the highest level one. These CR5 Cranium rats they each have an 8th level spell they can cast. And they didn't get to cast all their spells. One of them cast Confusion. Copper made his save, Judge failed. So Judge spent a round attacking Copper, I think, which was a lot of fun. And then the other heroes run in and start attacking the swarm. That was pretty fun. The players didn't think about, what if we leave our square? Will the swarm stay behind? And technically, according to the rules, yes, it would. But they never asked that. They probably assumed that if they moved, the swarm would move with them. That is a reasonable thing to conclude, but it is not literally true. So they didn't move. They just attacked the rats. There's no real rules in 5th edition for how hard is it for me to attack a swarm if it's on a friend of mine. It's left to, as are a lot of things, which is one of the things I like about 5th edition, it's left to the dungeon master to make that ruling. And so all I said was, you have no problem attacking rats swarming on another person unless you're making a ranged attack. If you're making a ranged attack, there's a chance that you may hit your teammate. So you can attack the rats on you, you can melee the rats on someone else, but if you're going to use a ranged attack, and that never happened though, so we didn't have to worry about that. Then after like one round of combat, the rats each used their dominate monster. Each rat swarm used dominate monster on the other PC, Copper and Judge. And keep in mind, the other heroes are now in this room attacking these guys, and both, even though it's a wisdom save, and the Chain of Acheron, with one exception, King, are terrible at wisdom saves, the heroes managed to make their saving throws, which was really disappointing to me. I thought it'd be really neat. But I was like, well, look, that's the way it goes. One of these rats hasn't used its confusion yet. If he lives till the next round, if that swarm lives one more round, I'll have it do its confusion. But alas, it did not. It was still a pretty memorable and fun encounter, and it felt like the heroes are dungeon crawlers. This is a normal adventure, but they're not just fighting rats. These cranium rats are basically the kinds of rats you would expect to fight on an illithid ship in the astral sea. And that's what made it fun for me. I would never just throw regular rats against a 5th level party, especially this 5th level party. That would be kind of almost insulting. But cranium rats I thought were perfectly apropos. Finishing up the cranium rats, I think some of the heroes took a little bit of damage from them, so they're slowly whittling through their resources, which should be fun to see what happens if we can get to 6 encounters, what actually starts to happen with using hit dice and taking rests, and whether or not the resource economy of 5th edition starts to shine, where normally it doesn't, because normally you get like 1 or 2 encounters per day, and the players can just always go Nova almost every battle. So this is encounter 2, and we're coming up on encounter 3. The heroes take care of the cranium rats, they continue exploring, they continue going up this sloping corridor until they come to 2 doors, one at the end of the corridor and one 90 degrees to the left, I think. And each door is this hard, it's like plastic, but these characters have never encountered plastic. So I described it as being just this like chitinous beetle-like exoskeleton door that is filling this orifice-like doorway. And Sweet, with his belt of hill giant strength and being a pugilist, just tries to punch his way through it. This has worked before with the gate in the city as they were escaping the fall of Blackbottom. And Phil rolls pretty badly, and this is a really tough door. And so because he's using the belt of hill giant strength, I rolled the d4 and I do a d4 points of damage to him, because I'm like, you're really strong, Phil, so when you hit something and it doesn't break, it does a little bit of damage to you. Meanwhile, there's like I described it as being like an iPad-sized piece of like glass or something, waist height to the right of the doorway. And I think the players instantly recognized, oh, this is some kind of like handprint door lock, which of course it was. I described the surface as being this this dark green substance with like little flecks of color in it, like the bottom of a mood ring. I said, have you guys seen mood rings? I don't think these things are popular anymore, but like my mom had one in the 70s. But the players understood the reference, and they pressed their hand up against it. And I described when they pull their hand off, they can see their handprint in this surface, and they can even see details like their fingerprints and stuff, but the green goes to like a pink color and nothing happens. So the player's like, we need a hand of the Mind Flayer. Let's go get the Mind Flayer's hand. So Nails goes off and chops off the hand of the Mind Flayer. They instantly figured this out. So this was another thing where I had no idea what the mechanism for getting in was going to be. I just knew there was going to be a door. I had some idea of how it worked, and I also knew they were going to need a Mind Flayer hand to get in, or a Dwagar hand would have done it. They would have been able to go below decks and grab a Dwagar hand. But I had no idea. I did not write down any descriptive text for this oval window, this opaque oval window next to the door. I just made it up on the fly, and again, that seemed to work. Phil at one point suggests to Tom that he have nails put, because these elithids, they don't have bones, they have the floppy, deflated balloon fingers of this mind flayer, and he's like, you should put it on like a glove, but he'd already taken it and pressed it up against this oval window, and the door opens, revealing this bright pink antechamber. There's a pool of white liquid, similar to the liquid that's been running down the corridor the entire time. Floating above the pool is this weird fleshy column with tentacles and an eyeball, and I showed them a picture of it, and Phil's like, wait a minute, we fought those before. He means he as a player has fought those before. It's a mind witness. I think they're really neat and kind of appropriate to what you would expect to find on an Illithid ship. And in this room with the mind witness are 2 Gith Yankee. I told the players I don't mind pulling the curtain back and giving the players information their characters would never have if I think it's dramatic. I said there's no way for your characters to know this, but this is the navigation room and you have found the navigator. So they know they're making progress. And here's a secret. It didn't matter which door they picked. One of the doors is basically an elevator that's going to lead them to the next level. It didn't matter which door they picked. They were going to get this encounter. I wouldn't do this if this were a video game, because video games, you can die and restart. And so part of the fun of that is learning, if I go through this door, this happens, and then your character dies and you just restart. And now you know something. You've learned a little bit more about the game, but there is no dying and restarting in RPGs. So in this instance, I felt perfectly within my rights to say whichever door they pick, they're going to get the navigator room. I think Judge made an Arcana check, and I told Anna and the party a little bit about what a mind witness is. It is intelligent, but it's basically like the ship's computer. So it will try to defend itself. It'll try to defend the ship, but I implied that they could interface with it, and it doesn't have free will. And so something you missed is that after the session, the players are like, I bet we could probably take this mind witness and interface with it somehow and get it to pilot the ship for us. We don't necessarily have to kill this thing. That's a very interesting idea. The players are super interested in trying to take the dark dream. And let me tell you, here's something that kind of reveals how even somebody who's been doing this for a long time can stuff just passes over their head and they never think about it. Never occurred to me that the players might try to steal the dark dream. I don't know why. It never occurred to me. It's the most obvious thing in the world that the heroes would be like, we want this ship. 100% they should want this ship. And I don't know whether or not it's possible for them to get it. This isn't really the story of the Chain of Acheron stealing the Dark Dream and becoming pirates of the timescape. I want them to be focused in capital, and them getting their own ship, especially a ship that can travel through the multiverse, I think would be inappropriate for a bunch of 5th level characters. That being said, everything that's happened so far, there'd be people watching that were like, oh my God, Matt's having them do all this crazy shit and they're only 5th level. Everything that's happened has been entirely 5th level appropriate, apart from the very first session with Relg and Ajax. That doesn't count, but everything else that's happened, every encounter they've gotten in is a perfectly legitimate thing. You can fight Dwagar. This Mind Witness and the 2 Gith is a very nasty encounter, but it's not ridiculously over the top. They're just 2 3rd level Gith and a 5th level Mind Witness. So they're going to try and steal the Dark Dream, and I think they're probably going to be able to get it for a little while. But I think getting the Dark Dream and kind of owning it and it being theirs is going to be wrapped up in what is happening to Nails, of which I will give you no more spoilers. We've already done that. And that's where we left it. That was the cliffhanger, it's now the heroes against the Navigator and the 2 Gith. And the players have figured out that the Gith and the Dwagar have revolted and taken over. And I think they may even have put together that Ajax was behind the revolt. The thing they haven't asked is, how did they find us on the astral sea? And there is an answer to that, and it's an important one. Although, don't overthink it. It's not going to be that big a deal. And we'll find out what happens next week. I think there's probably still 2 or 3 more encounters before they take the Dark Dream, and I'm really excited by that. So I think by the end of next week, they may have taken the ship. It depends on how much. There's going to be some more role-playing encounters, I think, and some more combat. And so far, it's awesome. I really like the way everyone's meshing together. Combat's going pretty fluidly. There's still some moments where, especially Anna playing the Illrigger, is trying. The Illrigger has a whole bunch of things they can do as a bonus action. I think I need to redo that because it's kind of the minor action problem from 4th edition. 4th edition said, okay, you get an action, you get a movement, and you get a minor action that you can use to do things like open a door or drink a potion. The problem was this was meant to be an incidental optional thing that you could ignore unless the situation called for it. But because it was a resource, a limited resource, every round, every player tried to think of something they could do with their minor action. It slowed everything down. down. So they rolled the minor action into you can interact with an object on your turn, and that solved the problem of what do I do with this resource. Bonus actions are kind of the minor action in 5th edition, where Anna, at least with the Illrigger, as a result of my design, my very early alpha design, has a lot of bonus action stuff she can do, and so every round she's trying to use that stuff. So I'm going to go back and look at the Illrigger and try to make Anna's life easier by making the class more straightforward. She has a lot of spells, and that fighting spellcasting class, I think, is perfectly legitimate. But right now, I think she underestimates how much damage she can do with her weapons, and she's trying to use her spells as though she's a spellcaster, as opposed to what they're supposed to be, which is much more situational. All of these are things we can fix. I'm looking forward to fixing them. So apart from Anna, I think taking a little longer, there's at least one round where Anna took a long time, and I could see on Phil's face, he was like, is this going to be how it is? But me watching, she was doing stuff the entire time. She just had a lot of stuff she could do. So that's on me to try to pare that stuff back and keep the utility of her character without requiring her to always be jumping through 2 or 3 different hoops every round to get all her stuff to work. So combat's going. Big Cat, by the way, the Monster Tamer Ranger is going great. Tom has worked out how Big Cat works, and I haven't yet had the experience of going, oh my God, I've got to nerf this class that I've kind of cobbled together, because Tom's Goblin Ranger with his Displacer Beast minion is just doing, like, for one thing, the Dwagar were able to pound on Big Cat, and they did like 30 points of damage to Big Cat, and that has to be healed, and that takes resources, but Big Cat's got like 90 hit points, so it wasn't that big a deal. But again, Big Cat can go down, and we saw that becoming a reality. So over the course of this adventure, who knows what'll happen. But so far, Big Cat, the Monster Tamer Ranger specialization is not proving a huge issue. The Illrigger needs a lot of work, but I'm looking forward to doing that. The players are in the middle of storming the Dark Dream. They're going to try and take it. They've got a lot of stuff left to do, including hopefully some unexpected turns in the dark corridors of the Somnium Tenebris. And of course, there is still the problem of nails, which is growing and will probably come to a head next session. Until next time, peace out.